Hi, I'm Stephanie, and this is Art History Storytime. This segment is called Art Under the Influence, and today we're talking about Pablo Picasso and opium. Picture it. It's a rainy evening in France. The year is 1904. You quickly walk the cobblestone streets in the Montmartre district of Paris, finally coming across Rue Ravignan and the dilapidated building known as Les Bateux-les-Voix. You hurry inside through the narrow hall and into one of the suites, where you find some of your buddies lying around the dim flickering light of the lamp, with the thick sweet smell of opium floating in the air. It can be hard to separate the human from the icon. There's no denying the huge impact Pablo Picasso had on 20th century art. Nothing is ever purely original, but the man got fairly close in some ways. At the same time, it's hard to ignore the awful and cruel, toxic person he was, particularly to those very close to him. But that's a video for another time. Today I just want to focus on Picasso in his youth and the art he made while opium was present in his life. What is known as the Blue Period in Picasso's career spanned from about 1901 to 1904. This phase was marked by a specific event, the suicide of his close friend Carlos Casagemas. Carlos Casagemas was a Catalan poet and painter and good friend of Picasso's during their late teen years. The two of them traveled around Spain together and eventually ended up in Paris, where they shared a studio together. They would frequent the brothels and the bars in Paris and overall had a great time together. Casagemas suffered from depression and intense mood swings, which sadly culminated in his suicide. On the evening of February 17, 1901, he invited several friends over for dinner at the Hippodrome Café in Paris. Among them was Germaine, a love interest that he had been unsuccessful with in the past. At dinner, he attempted once more and asked her if she would marry him. At her final rejection, he attempted to shoot her, but failed before turning the gun on himself and delivering a fatal blow to his right temple. He was only 20 years old. Picasso was devastated at the death of his friend. He stayed at the studio they once shared and continued to paint, despite his mental state becoming worse as the year went on. Picasso's depression intensified, and his paintings evolved into monochromatic blues and greens with somber subject matter. Typically, those depicted were impoverished, lonely, ill, elderly, and themselves melancholy. This blue period went on for about 3 more years. In 1904, a few things happened that helped Picasso out of his downward spiral. He moved into one of the Les Bateux-les-Voix studios and was now surrounded by other painters, poets, musicians, and friendly company of the French Avant-Garde. This was an artsy hotspot. He then met and was in a romantic relationship with Ferdinand Olivier. This was his first serious relationship. She was his lover and model, appearing in over 60 works by Picasso. It was around this time that Picasso was introduced to opium. It's not clear where and when he took his first puff, but the drug wasn't illegal yet, and it was readily available at opium dens in Paris. Opium had been gaining popularity, starting with French soldiers bringing it home after the Indochina conflicts. Other tenants of the Bateux-les-Voix would join in on the smoking circles on any given evening. It was the drug of choice for those wanting a dose of escapism, something to relax the body, ease the mind, and let the user surrender to a dreamy haze and forget their troubles. Olivier kept a diary and later in life would release 2 books about her time with Picasso. In an entry in July of 1905, she writes about how time would slip by and the miseries of their surroundings would be transformed into an atmosphere of heightened intelligence, subtlety, and delicious contentment, in which everything became beautiful and noble. Even with the addictive properties of opium, Picasso remained diligent about his work. To him, painting was sacrosanct. It came above everything and everyone else. Now in his new home and surrounded by new friends, the fog of depression began to lift, and Picasso entered what is known as the Rose period of his work, between 1904 and 1906. As the name implies, Rose period works are typically pink, orange, and earth tones. The whole phase is marked by warm hues and warm subject matter. No longer do his subjects look depressed or on the brink of death. Circus characters are now a common subject, particularly the Harlequin, and themes of closeness and joy become more common. This is also when we start to see his style choices become more focused. Picasso started out as an academically trained artist. He knew how to render realistic human form, but that wasn't the point, or his intended message. Here we start to see surface planes and gradients become flatter. The figures start gaining a slightly elongated, angular, and illustrative quality about them. The line work continues to grow more fluid and expressive, more attentive to displaying a gesture rather than realistic depiction. Although happier in a sense, some of his figures still hold a feeling of listlessness as they stare out into space, and I wonder if this is a direct or indirect effect of opium's influence. In June of 1906, Picasso traveled to the small Spanish village of Gossol, where he got to see paintings from El Greco and Catalonian art, including Iberian sculpture. Then there's a visit to the Trocadero Museum of Ethnology, a visit he claims leaves him forever changed, thus igniting the African period between 1907 and 1909. But he was not alone in his new fascination with cultures of the African continent. Due to French colonization and expansion into sub-Saharan regions, there was a collective European interest in all things deemed exotic. But then again, when has there not? It's worth noting that Les Bâtons-le-Voix is located in the 18th arrondissement, which also contains the North African and African district of Goutte d'Or. Here you could find a colorful and bustling market, the Marché Barbet. It's likely that Picasso visited this market and saw or even collected art pieces for inspiration or reference. Maybe. There's a lot of criticism surrounding the African influence period. Some argue he appropriated visual references from cultures that were not his own and never credited the original source. But none of his paintings can be directly attributed to a specific culture's iconography. Although yes, the influence is clearly there. So doesn't that mean he did exactly what any artist should do? You take in the external and output a synthesis of your own mentally digested material? After all, good artists borrow, great artists steal. Probably his most iconic work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the women in the composition appear to resemble tribal African depictions of the human form mixed with modern abstractions. A quote from the Modern Museum of Art reads, "In this painting, he did away with pre-existing artistic conventions like naturalism and perspective, hurling even the most forward-thinking viewers into a future they weren't quite ready for." I think this man was in the process of carving out his path toward modernism and cubism. Karl Wiens-Wiegels was a German painter that also lived at Les Bâtons-le-Voix. He and Picasso became good friends, but unfortunately in the spring of 1908, Wiegels suffered a psychotic breakdown after consuming a mixture of opium, hashish, and ether, and hung himself from the ceiling beam. Picasso was the one to find his body, and he was once again struck by shock and grief. After Wiegels' death, Picasso began to gain more concern with his own health and stopped drinking for a time and gave up opium once and for all. In that same year, France instituted strict controls over the commerce and consumption of opium, which may have limited his access to the drug anyway. With all that in mind, who is to say how much of an effect opium actually had on Picasso's choice of subject matter and art-making methods? On one hand, one can't deny that the intake of any chemical compounds, natural or synthetic, has an effect on the body and mind, and therefore the art that person produces. On the other hand, maybe it affected his art as much as the current season or what he had for lunch that day. I wonder if he would have produced the same type of art had he never smoked opium. Would he have arrived at the same conclusions and stylistic decisions? At least the fact that he consistently created paintings from 1904 to 1908 points to opium not being something that inhibited his productivity. The question remains, though, about how much the drug affected him on an intellectual or spiritual level. And since his art meant everything to him, who he was and what he did at any given time in his life creates an essence that is forever imprinted in all of his work. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find these moments and stories in history as interesting as I do. If you enjoyed this video, I'd deeply appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe for more art-related content.